The mahogany doors of the courthouse felt colder than the winter air outside. 3 months ago, he threw that platinum band at my face, his laughter ringing like a death knell while he claimed I was nothing. Today, his family glares from across the aisle, expecting me to beg for crumbs. They think I am here for mercy. They are wrong. One phone call changed everything. I am here to end the game. My name is Evelyn Harper, and at 34 years old, I have learned that the loudest sounds are often the ones no one hears. I stood on the granite steps of the county courthouse at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, watching the sea of reporters part for the Hale family. The flashbulbs were blinding, reflecting off the polished gold of Marcus's watch and the heavy diamonds dripping from his mother's ears. They moved with the synchronized grace of a predatory pack, draped in thousands of dollars of Italian wool and French silk. I, by contrast, wore a charcoal suit I bought on sale 3 years ago and a pair of sensible heels. To the onlookers, I was the discarded wife, a tragic figure destined to be crushed by the sheer weight of the Hale empire. Beatrice Hale, my mother-in-law, stopped just inches from me. Her eyes traveled down my outfit with a clinical sort of disgust, the kind one might reserve for a stain on a white rug. She leaned in, her perfume cloying and expensive, a scent that cost more per ounce than my monthly mortgage. "You really have no shame." "Do you?" Beatrice whispered, her voice a sharp blade wrapped in velvet. "To show your face here after everything Marcus has done for you. You were always just a charity case. We should have known when that boy left you at the altar 10 years ago that you were nothing but damaged goods. I felt the phantom weight of that decade-old humiliation." I remembered standing in a white dress that felt like a shroud, waiting for a man who never came. That failure had defined me in the eyes of this city for a long time. It was why Marcus thought I was an easy target. He saw a woman who had already been broken and assumed I would be grateful for the scraps he tossed my way. The cameras caught every second of it. The poor Evelyn narrative was exactly what they wanted. Marcus arrived a moment later, flanked by a legal team that charged $1,000 an hour. He didn't look at me. He didn't have to. 3 months ago, in our living room, he had pulled the 5-carat diamond from his pocket and threw it at my feet. It had skittered across the hardwood floor like a common marble. "Your fiancé was smart to run." Marcus had laughed then, his face contorted with a cruel triumph. "He saw what you were before the ink was dry. Now, take what's left of your pride and sign the papers. You aren't smart enough to even understand how any of this works anyway." The memory burned, but I kept my face a mask of iron. The Hales believed they were walking into a coronation where they would officially strip me of my dignity and my future. They had no idea that the passive, silent woman they had bullied for 5 years had spent the last 90 days sharpening a different kind of weapon. The bailiff opened the heavy oak doors, and the air inside the courtroom was thick with the scent of old paper and impending doom. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket that muffled the frantic clicking of the media's keyboards. As I walked to my table, I felt the weight of their collective contempt. It was a physical pressure, a 100% focus on my perceived weakness. I pulled out my chair and sat down, smoothing my skirt with steady hands. Across the aisle, Marcus whispered something to his lead counsel, a smug grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. He looked like a man who had already won the lottery. I looked down at my bare ring finger, then looked up, catching his eye for a split second. I didn't scowl. I didn't cry. I simply allowed a tiny, razor-sharp flash of confidence to reach my eyes. The storm was here, but for the first time in my life, I was not the one who needed an umbrella. I met Marcus Hale 5 years ago on a rainy Tuesday in October. At the time, I was working 60 hours a week at a boutique marketing firm, desperately trying to prove I belonged in a world that usually ignored people like me. Marcus was the rising star of the venture capital scene, a man whose ambition radiated off him like heat from a furnace. He did not just walk into a room, he owned the air inside it. To a woman who felt invisible, his attention was like a spotlight that promised warmth but eventually began to burn. In the beginning, he made me feel like an equal partner in a grand adventure. He listened to my ideas and complimented my intellect, or so I thought. But the control started small, like a thin silk thread wrapped around my wrist that tightened every time I moved. It was always framed as concern, a subtle sculpting of my identity to fit his aesthetic. "Evelyn, honey, that dress is lovely, but maybe it is a bit too modest for the donors we are meeting tonight," Marcus would say, his hand resting gently on the small of my back in a way that felt more like a nudge than a caress. "We want them to see you as a Hale, not just another girl from the suburbs." His family was a different story entirely. To Beatrice and the rest of the Hale clan, my middle-class upbringing was a joke they never tired of telling. At Sunday brunches where the champagne cost $500 a bottle, they would dissect my background with surgical precision. They looked at my parents, a retired teacher, and a factory worker, as if they were museum exhibits from a dying civilization. "It is so charming how your father worked 30 years in a factory," Beatrice said once, her laughter tinkling like breaking glass against the fine china. "I suppose that is where you get your sturdy constitution. Evelyn, most women in our circle would simply crumble under the weight of such a common life." The table erupted in polite, muffled chuckles. Marcus did not defend me. He simply squeezed my hand under the table, a gesture I mistakenly took for support but later realized was a silent command to keep my mouth shut. These cruel little jokes became psychological wounds that never quite healed. They were constant reminders that I was a guest in their world, invited only so long as I remained decorative and silent. What made me so susceptible to Marcus's manipulation was the ghost of my past. 2 years before I met him, my first fiancé had vanished 48 hours before our wedding day. I was left with a non-refundable deposit of $15,000 and a hole in my heart that felt like a permanent eclipse. The shame of being the girl who was not worth staying for was a weight I carried every day. I was raw, broken, and terrified of being abandoned again. Marcus knew this. He used it as the foundation for his throne. "I know how much you hurt after what happened with him," Marcus whispered to me one night, early in our marriage, as I cried over a perceived slight from his sister. "But I am here now. I am the one who rescued you from that embarrassment. You should remember that whenever you feel like questioning my decisions. Evelyn." He cast himself as my savior, the man who had redeemed my reputation by giving me his prestigious name. It was a brilliant move. By positioning himself as my protector, he made it impossible for me to voice any dissent without feeling like an ingrate. I learned to survive by becoming a shadow. I learned that if I stayed silent and performed the role of the grateful wife, the barbs hit less frequently. But silence is not the same thing as submission. While Marcus was busy patting himself on the back for his latest multi-million-dollar acquisition, I was watching, I was listening. I began to notice the way he whispered into his phone at 2 o'clock in the morning and the way his face darkened when certain folders were left on his desk. The seeds of my rebellion were planted in those quiet hours of observation. I did not have a plan yet, but I had a realization. Marcus Hale had not saved me. He had simply bought a new asset, and he had vastly underestimated the intelligence of the woman he thought he had broken. "You are so quiet tonight, Evelyn," Marcus remarked as he poured himself a glass of bourbon. "Are you finally learning your place?" I looked at him and forced a thin, fragile smile that did not reach my eyes. "I am just thinking about how much I owe you, Marcus." He nodded, satisfied with my answer, and turned back to his laptop. He had no idea that beneath that smile, I was already beginning to count the cost of his total destruction. The investigation did not start with a grand revelation. It began with a misplaced tax form. It was a Tuesday evening, around 7 o'clock, when I found a document for something called E.H. Holdings Limited Liability Company. My initials. I had never signed a single paper for such an entity. While Marcus was at his gym, spending 2 hours on his physique, I was at his home office desk, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I discovered transactions that defied any legal logic. Wire transfers of $50,000 here, $120,000 there, and one reaching as high as $250,000. They moved like ghosts through accounts I supposedly owned. I realized Marcus was not just wealthy. He was using me as a ghost to haunt the financial system. I bought a small, encrypted thumb drive for $40 and began the tedious process of backing up every email, digital contract, and spreadsheet I could find. I stayed up until 3 in the morning, my eyes burning from the blue light of the monitor, downloading file after file. I spent my lunch breaks at the public library, far from the prying eyes of the Hale social circle, reading about community property laws and personal liability. The law was clear if these companies defaulted or were found guilty of fraud. The person whose name was on the dotted line would be the one going to prison. That person was me. Evelyn. "Why are you still awake?" Marcus asked one night, leaning against the doorframe of the study. His voice was thick with sleep and a hint of annoyance. I quickly closed the browser tab showing the state's penal code. I kept my voice small, the voice of the woman he thought he knew. I just could not sleep. "Marcus, I was looking at some interior design blogs for the guest room." He sighed, a sound of pure condescension that grated against my nerves. "Do not strain your brain with that. Just pick something beige and expensive. You know I do not like clutter." "Of course," I whispered, keeping my head down so he could not see the fire in my eyes. "I am sorry. I will come to bed now." My passivity was my greatest shield, because he believed I was a simpleton who barely understood how to balance a checkbook. He became careless. The breakthrough happened when he left his laptop unlocked while taking a shower. It took me less than 5 minutes to find the folder labeled contingency. Inside were drafts of a post-nuptial agreement he intended to trick me into signing. It was designed to shift all debt from his primary firm to EH Holdings while keeping 95% of the assets in his name. I was not a wife to him. I was a legal shield. I was the person who would sit in a deposition or a jail cell while he sailed off on a yacht bought with the money he had laundered through my identity. The anger was cold, a deep-seated frost that settled in my marrow. My first instinct was to scream, to throw the laptop at the bathroom door and demand an explanation. But I remembered my father's words about playing chess. Never reveal your queen until the king has nowhere to run. "Is everything okay in there?" Marcus called out over the splashing sound of the water. I gripped the edge of the desk until my knuckles turned white, my breath hitching in my chest. "Yes, everything is fine. I am just tidying up your papers." I did not confront him. I did not cry. Instead, I opened my thumb drive and copied the entire contingency folder. I would wait. I would watch. I would let him believe he was the master of this house while I quietly dismantled the foundations of his empire. Marcus thought he had married a victim he could discard when the legal heat became too much, but he had actually invited the investigator into his own bedroom. I walked back to our room, counting my steps, focused on the 100% certainty that I would be the last one standing. "Evelyn, don't be tedious. Just sign the bottom of page 12, Marcus said, his voice dripping with an impatience that felt like a physical slap. We were in his mahogany-paneled library at 7 o'clock on a Thursday night. His personal attorney, a man named Henderson who looked like he had been carved out of gray stone, sat across from us. I don't understand what this transfer of liability means." "Marcus," I whispered, my hand trembling slightly as I held the heavy fountain pen. Marcus let out a short, jagged bark of laughter and looked at Henderson. "See, I told you. You could explain the law to her for 100 years, and she still would not get it. My wife she is many things, but she is certainly not smart enough to understand business. She barely managed a marketing degree at a state school. Beatrice leaned over my shoulder, her breath smelling of peppermint and expensive gin. It is for your own protection. Evelyn, if the markets dip by even 5 or 10%, this ensures our family assets remain secure. Do not be such a difficult girl. Just sign. I felt the walls closing in. This was the post-nuptial agreement I had seen on his laptop. They were trying to finalize the trap. I let the pen clatter to the desk, my breathing becoming shallow and ragged. I stood up abruptly, knocking my chair back. I can't do this right now. I gasped, clutching my throat. The air. It feels so thin. I need to lie down. I think I am having a panic attack. For God's sake, Evelyn! Marcus groaned, but he didn't follow me. I saw him exchange a satisfied look with Henderson. To them, my breakdown was proof of my weakness. They thought they had already won. I retreated to the master bedroom and locked the door. My heart was actually racing, but not from fear. It was the adrenaline of the performance. 10 minutes later, my personal cell phone vibrated. It was an unknown number. I answered, my voice still shaky. Hello. Listen carefully. A distorted, low voice said on the other end, the documents they want you to sign tonight. They carry a 100% chance of a federal indictment. If the Securities and Exchange Commission moves in, you are the only name on the hook. You are being set up to take the fall for everything. Get out now. The line went dead. I stared at the screen, the cold reality of the situation sinking in. I wasn't just a shield. I was the sacrificial lamb. Marcus wasn't just hiding money. He was committing crimes, and he had built a paper trail that ended at my doorstep. If I didn't move now, I would spend the next 20 years in a federal prison while Marcus and Beatrice laughed about it in the Hamptons. I knew I couldn't trust Henderson or anyone in the Hales circle. I needed someone who played the game better than they did. I spent the next 2 hours on a hidden browser, searching for names until I found one that appeared in the footnotes of the biggest financial fraud cases in the city. Rachel Monroe. The following afternoon, I told Marcus I was going to a spa for a 4-hour treatment. Instead, I drove 45 minutes out of the city to a nondescript office building near the waterfront. I wore a blonde wig and sunglasses, feeling like a character in a spy novel, but the stakes were too high for embarrassment. I walked into a cramped office that smelled of stale coffee and old law books. A woman with sharp, gray eyes looked up from a mountain of paperwork. You're late, she said, checking her watch. It is exactly 2 minutes past 3 o'clock. I don't like wasting my time. Mrs. Hale, I'm sorry, I said, sitting down and pulling the thumb drive from my purse. I think my husband is trying to put me in prison. I have 3 months of financial records here. Please tell me you can help me. Rachel Monroe didn't smile. She took the drive and plugged it into a dedicated laptop. Let's see just how deep this hole goes. The meeting was the point of no return. As she began to scroll through the files, I knew the version of Evelyn Harper who stayed silent was officially dead. Rachel Monroe did not look like the high-powered lawyers Marcus usually hired to bully his competitors. She didn't wear $5,000 suits or flash gold jewelry. She sat behind a desk cluttered with stacks of paper that reached toward the ceiling, lit by a single, harsh, fluorescent bulb that made the room feel like an interrogation cell. She took the thumb drive from me with a gloved hand and plugged it into a terminal that wasn't even connected to the internet. Give me 30 minutes, she said, her voice like sandpaper on old wood. Sit, drink the coffee. It is terrible, but it is hot. I watched her eyes move behind thin, rectangular glasses. They didn't just read, they scanned, processed, and categorized. For 20 minutes, the only sound in the room was the hum of the cooling fan and the occasional click of a mouse. Then, she leaned back and looked at me, her expression unreadable. Mrs. Hale, Do you truly realize what you have brought me? Rachel asked, her voice dropping an octave. I know he is hiding money, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I know he is using Holdings to avoid taxes. Rachel let out a cold, dry chuckle that held no humor. Avoid taxes, Evelyn. That is like saying a hurricane is just a bit of wind. This is not a divorce case anymore. This is a multi-layered, 99% effective money laundering machine. Look here. She turned the monitor toward me, pointing at a series of interconnected digital maps. He has moved nearly $40 million through accounts in your name over the last 3 years. These companies buy properties, sell them to each other at a loss, and then claim a total tax write-off. He is not just cheating on you. He is defrauding the federal government on a scale that would make a cartel boss jealous. I felt the blood drain from my face. The room seemed to spin, and for a moment, I couldn't find my breath. If they find out. If the authorities look at this, they will come for me first, won't they? Rachel nodded slowly, her gaze piercing. 100%. You are the sole signatory on every single one of these shell companies. He has built a fortress around himself and used you as the bricks. If this ship sinks, Marcus Hale has a lifeboat, and you have a lead anchor tied to your waist. She stood up and paced the small office, her heels clicking rhythmically on the linoleum. We cannot simply file for a standard divorce. If we do that now, his legal team will realize there is a leak, and they will burn every piece of evidence before we even reach discovery. We need to go for the throat, but we need to do it where he feels the most invincible. Where I asked, gripping the arms of my chair, the preliminary hearing, Rachel said, her eyes gleaming with a predatory light. Between now and then, you are going to be the most obedient, fragile, and confused wife he has ever seen. You will not question him. You will not look at his phone. When his mother insults your family, you will. You will just look at your shoes and apologize. I don't know if I can keep doing that, I admitted, my hands shaking in my lap. It feels like I am disappearing into his shadow. Rachel walked over and gripped my shoulders. Her hands were surprisingly strong, grounding me. Listen to me. Every time he calls you stupid, every time he laughs at your simple background, I want you to count to 10 and remember this room. He thinks he is playing checkers with a child. He has no idea he is actually sitting across from a grandmaster. Strategic patience is your only weapon right now. If you break character for even 1 second, we lose everything. We spent the next 2 hours outlining a legal strike that would move faster than Marcus could react. We wouldn't just ask for a settlement. We were going to present the court with a complete map of his criminal activities at the exact moment he tried to finalize that post-nuptial agreement. It was a high-stakes gamble, but it was the only way to ensure I wasn't the one wearing handcuffs by the end of the year. I will have the filings ready by next month, Rachel said, escorting me to the door. Until then, stay small, stay quiet. Let him believe his own lie. I stepped out into the humid afternoon air, the weight of the secret feeling like a physical burden. But as I drove back to the mansion, I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a predator in hiding. Marcus thought he was the only one who was smart. He was about to find out just how expensive that assumption was going to be. The courtroom felt smaller than it had 30 minutes ago. Marcus sat at the petitioner's table, leaning back with a casual arrogance that suggested he was merely waiting for a tedious formality to conclude. His lead attorney, Henderson, stood before the bench, his voice echoing with a practiced, smooth authority. He spoke about the prenuptial agreement and the proposed post-nuptial settlement as if they were divine decrees. Your Honor, it is quite simple, Henderson said, gesturing dismissively toward me without even turning his head. Mrs. Hale has enjoyed a lifestyle funded entirely by my client's hard work for 5 years. She possesses no independent business acumen. Our proposal of $250,000 and the secondary property in Connecticut is more than generous. In fact, given her limited understanding of the marital estate, she should be eager to sign. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded on the table. Beside me, Rachel Monroe remained silent, a stark contrast to Henderson's theatrical performance. I didn't look at Marcus, but I could feel his gaze on me cold, mocking, and 100% certain of his victory. Judge Miller, a woman who looked like she had seen every trick in the legal playbook over the last 20 years, leaned forward. She adjusted her glasses and looked down at the thick folder in front of her. "Mr. Henderson," the judge interrupted, her voice cutting through the lawyer's monologue. "I am looking at the schedule of assets provided by the respondent. I see a company titled E.H. Holdings recorded here. Can you explain why $52 million in commercial real estate acquisitions were routed through this specific entity over the last 24 months? The air in the room seemed to vanish. Marcus shifted in his seat, his smirk faltering for the first time. Henderson paused, his mouth hanging open for a fraction of a second before he regained his footing. "Your Honor, that is a private investment vehicle," Henderson stammered. "It is technically in Mrs. Hale's name for tax efficiency purposes, but, as I stated, she has no active role in its management. It is purely a formal arrangement." A formal arrangement. Judge Miller's eyebrows shot up. $52 million is a very loud formality, Mr. Henderson. And I noticed that the tax filings for this entity were signed under penalty of perjury by Evelyn Harper Hale alone. Mr. Hale, did you disclose the full extent of the liabilities attached to this company to your wife? Marcus stood up, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "Your Honor, my wife she is confused about the details. She signed those papers because she trusted my judgment. She doesn't know the first thing about corporate structures. This is just a clerical misunderstanding." From the front row, I heard a sharp intake of breath. Beatrice Hale leaned forward, her knuckles white as she gripped the wooden railing. "This is ridiculous," she hissed, loud enough for the court reporter to look up. "My son has provided everything for that girl. This is an outrage. Sit down, Mrs. Hale," the judge snapped, her gavel hitting the desk with a sharp crack. I remained a statue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't cry. I watched Marcus, whose breathing was now heavy and uneven. He looked like a man who had just realized the floor beneath him was made of thin glass. The power in the room had shifted. It was no longer about a divorce settlement. It was about a paper trail that led directly to a federal crime. Rachel Monroe chose that exact moment to rise. She didn't shout. She didn't use flowery language. She simply placed a small stack of documents on the podium. "Your Honor," Rachel said, her voice steady and lethal, "we believe the court has been misled. We would like to present additional evidence, specifically 6 months of internal communications and offshore wire transfer receipts that were not included in the petitioner's discovery. These documents show a 98% discrepancy between the reported assets and the actual flow of capital. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. It was as if the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. The reporters in the back row stopped whispering and began typing furiously. Marcus looked at the documents in Rachel's hand, then looked at me. For the first time in 5 years, he wasn't looking at a charity case or a simpleton. He was looking at the woman who held his entire life in her hands. I need a moment to consult with my client," Henderson whispered, his voice cracking. "No," Judge Miller said, her eyes fixed on Marcus. "We are going to stay right here and look at these together." I looked at Marcus and let the smallest, coldest smile touch my lips. The game was no longer being played by his rules. Rachel laid the first document on the digital projector, and the image bloomed across the large screen for the entire courtroom to see. It was a wire transfer authorization for $8 million. At the bottom was a signature that looked remarkably like mine, but the loops were too tight and the pressure on the pen was far too heavy. Your Honor, Rachel's voice was as steady and cold as a winter morning. This document was signed on the 14th of June, on that specific day. Evelyn Harper was at her father's bedside in a hospital 300 miles away. We have the medical records to prove she was nowhere near a bank. This signature is a 100% forgery. Marcus's chair screeched against the floor as he stood up abruptly. His face was no longer the arrogant mask of a victor. It was a sickly mottled gray. That is impossible. She must have signed it before she left. She is lying. She is trying to ruin me. Sit down, Mr. Hale. Judge Miller barked, her eyes fixed on the screen with a growing intensity. Rachel didn't pause for even a heartbeat. She flipped to the next file, a spreadsheet showing a series of payments to a shell company in Delaware. These are not business expenses, Your Honor. These are bribes. $150,000 to a city councilman for a zoning variance, $200,000 to a Port Authority official. All of it was laundered through accounts bearing my client's name to ensure that if the trail was ever followed, the handcuffs would go on her wrists, not his. She was used as a human shield for a criminal enterprise. The gallery erupted. I could hear the frantic scratching of pens and the rapid-fire tapping of phone screens as the reporters in the back row realized the divorce of the year had just become the financial scandal of the decade. Marcus turned to his lawyer, Henderson, but the man was busy staring at his own shoes, his face drained of all color. The arrogance that had defined Marcus for years was evaporating, leaving behind a desperate, cornered animal. It was not just Marcus, Rachel continued, pointing a finger directly at the front row where the Hale family sat. The Hale Family Trust, managed by Beatrice Hale, received 40% of the kickbacks from these specific transactions. This was a family-wide effort to use Evelyn Harper as a legal buffer for federal racketeering and tax evasion. Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her throat as if to catch the pearls she was wearing. How dare you? You little. We took her in. We gave her everything. Her voice cracked, a high-pitched sound of pure, unadulterated panic. Marcus, do something. But Marcus couldn't do anything. He was staring at the latest document. Rachel had pulled up a record of a federal wire transfer that crossed state lines and involved a bank in the Cayman Islands. It was a direct violation of federal banking laws. The clever system he had built was now a noose tightening around his neck. He looked at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. I didn't. It was the accountants. They told me it was legal. Marcus stammered, his breath hitching as he struggled to find words that were no longer there to save him. The judge slammed her gavel down, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. I have heard enough for today. This court is no longer just presiding over a simple division of marital assets. Based on the overwhelming evidence of forgery, bribery, and federal financial crimes, I am ordering an immediate and total expansion of this investigation. Judge Miller looked at Marcus with a disgust so profound it seemed to fill the entire room. Mr. Hale, you did not just lie to your wife. You attempted to use the legal system of this country as a weapon of abuse. I want every ledger, every email, and every bank record from the Hale Family Trust delivered to this court by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Do not test my patience. The room was a chaos of noise and flashing lights as reporters surged forward, but I sat in the center of it, as still as a deep pond. I finally looked Marcus in the eye. He was shaking, a fine tremor that started in his hands and moved up his arms. He had spent years telling me I wasn't smart enough to understand his world. Now, as the bailiffs stepped closer and the cameras clicked. He was finally realizing that I understood it well enough to destroy it. "Evelyn!" Marcus's voice cracked through the courtroom, raw and jagged. For the first time since we entered this building, he didn't look past me or through me. He looked directly at me. His eyes were bloodshot, the pupils blown wide with a mixture of disbelief and pure, unadulterated rage. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard his knuckles looked like white stones. How could you do this?" He spat, his voice trembling with a frantic energy. "Everything I built, everything I gave you. You sat in our house, ate at my table, and you were recording me. You were stealing my life while I was trying to protect you." I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I met his gaze with a stillness that seemed to unnerve him more than any scream could have. My heart wasn't racing anymore. It was beating with a steady 99% efficiency. "I wasn't stealing your life, Marcus," I said, my voice low and clear, carrying to every corner of the room. "I was documenting how you were trying to end mine. I never knew about the 85 shell companies. I never knew about the $40 million moved to the Caymans in my name. I was just the girl who wasn't smart enough to understand business. Remember." Rachel Monroe stepped forward then, holding a laser pointer like a conductor's baton. She projected a massive, complex flowchart onto the screen. It looked like a spider web, with my name at the center and dozens of lines bleeding out toward offshore accounts, bribed officials, and forged contracts. "As the court can see," Rachel said, her voice echoing the cold logic of the evidence, "Mr. Hale created a 98% failure rate for Mrs. Hale's personal liability while retaining 100% of the profit for the Hale Family Trust. He didn't just hide assets, he manufactured a fall guy." Marcus turned back to the judge, his hands gesturing wildly. "She is lying. She knew. She wanted the money. She was the one who asked for the offshore accounts because she was greedy." Judge Miller looked at him over the rim of her glasses, her expression one of pure granite. "Mr. Hale, just 10 minutes ago you testified that your wife didn't have the intellectual capacity to understand a basic bank statement. Now you are claiming she was the mastermind behind a multi-million-dollar international tax evasion scheme. Which is it?" Marcus opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at Henderson, who was busy packing his briefcase, refusing to meet his client's eye. The contradiction was absolute, 100%. He had spent years building a narrative that I was a simpleton to protect himself, and now that very lie was the cage he couldn't escape. In the gallery, the gasps were audible. Beatrice Hale had slumped in her seat, her face buried in her hands. The Hale name, which had stood for prestige and power in this city for over 50 years, was disintegrating in real time. The socialites who had laughed at my common background were now watching the live stream on their phones, realizing that the Hales were not royalty, they were just common criminals in better suits. The legal pressure was a physical weight now, pressing down on Marcus until he looked smaller, older, and utterly defeated. The bailiffs shifted their weight, their eyes locked on him as if he were already a prisoner. It was in that moment, as Marcus began to hyperventilate, his chest heaving as he gasped, I can't. I need air," that the entire room realized the truth. This wasn't a lucky break for me. This wasn't a sudden discovery. They looked at my calm face, my steady hands, and my expensive lawyer whom I had hired months ago in secret. They realized that every insult Marcus had thrown at me, every time he had called me stupid or mocked my past, I had used it as cover to dig his grave. I hadn't just won the case today. I had won it the second he threw that ring at my face and laughed. I had been 5 steps ahead of him for 90 days. And he was only just now realizing he was already at the finish line, and I was the one holding the gavel. The silence that followed was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. Judge Miller did not wait for the defense to offer another hollow excuse. She leaned over her bench, her face a mask of uncompromising authority, and the sound of her voice felt like a heavy weight settling over the room. "I have seen enough," Judge Miller declared, her words echoing off the high marble walls. "Under the authority vested in this court, I am ordering an immediate and total freeze of 100% of the assets belonging to Marcus Hale, the Hale Family Trust, and every subsidiary listed in these documents. Not $1, not 1 cent is to be moved, transferred, or hidden until this investigation is complete." Marcus looked as though he had been struck. He slumped back into his chair, his mouth hanging open, his expensive suit suddenly looking 3 sizes too large for his shrinking frame. Beside him, Henderson was frantically shoving papers into his briefcase, his hands shaking so violently that he dropped his gold pen. The man who had spent the last hour calling me a simpleton couldn't even look in my direction. He was a defeated man, and he knew it. Furthermore, the judge continued, her gaze shifting to me with a brief, softening nod. "The court finds that the respondent, Evelyn Harper, was a victim of systematic financial coercion and criminal forgery. The evidence clearly shows she had zero knowledge of these transactions. As of this moment, Evelyn Harper is officially cleared of all criminal liability. She is not a defendant. She is a victim of a 5-year-long fraud." I felt a shiver run down my spine, not of fear, but of an overwhelming, pure relief. The anchor Marcus had tried to tie around my neck had just been cut loose. This matter has now escalated beyond the jurisdiction of family law, Judge Miller stated firmly. At exactly 4 o'clock this afternoon, the entirety of this case file, including the digital evidence provided by Ms. Harper, will be transferred to the Federal Financial Integrity Bureau. Mr. Hale, I strongly suggest you do not attempt to leave the city. You are now facing federal prosecution for racketeering, tax evasion, and forgery on a scale this court has rarely seen. Marcus tried to stand, but his legs seemed to give way. Your Honor, I was only... It was for the legacy, the family. His voice trailed off into a ragged, pathetic whisper. Everything is gone. Everything I did was for nothing. Beatrice Hale stood up in the front row, her face contorted in a mask of pure venom. You ungrateful little snake, she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. We gave you a name. We gave you a life. You think you can just destroy us like this. Quiet Judge Miller's gavel slammed down with the force of a thunderclap. Mrs. Hale, I am issuing a permanent order of protection. You, your son, and every member of your family are prohibited from coming within 500 feet of Evelyn Harper. If you so much as send a text message to her, you will find yourselves in a holding cell before the sun sets. Am I 100% clear? Beatrice collapsed back into her seat, sobbing into a silk handkerchief that probably cost more than my first car. The power they had wielded over me for years had evaporated in less than 60 minutes. As the judge adjourned the session, the heavy doors at the back of the room swung open, and a swarm of reporters surged toward the railing. The atmosphere had flipped entirely. They weren't looking for a quote from the billionaire genius Marcus Hale anymore. The cameras were aimed at me. Evelyn. Over here, one reporter shouted, holding a microphone over the wood railing. How long were you planning this? Are you the key witness for the Federal Financial Integrity Bureau? Evelyn. Do you have a comment on the $80 million in forged contracts another called out? I stood up slowly, smoothing my charcoal jacket. I looked at Marcus, who was being flanked by 2 court bailiffs. He looked small. He looked like the coward he had always been. There was no one left to laugh at me. There were no more jokes about my middle-class roots or my limited intelligence. The world finally saw what I had known for a long time. I was the smartest person in every room Marcus had ever brought me into. I stayed in my seat for a moment, watching the dust settle as the silence of my victory became the loudest thing in the building. As the judge exited through the side door, the reality of the situation finally settled over the Hales like a cold, wet shroud. Marcus sat frozen, his hands still clutching the edge of the mahogany table as if it were the last piece of driftwood from a sinking ship. His lawyers were already looking at their watches, calculating how quickly they could distance themselves from a man whose name was now a liability. Two men in dark, nondescript suits stepped forward from the back of the room. They weren't court bailiffs, they were agents from the Federal Financial Integrity Bureau. They stood behind Marcus, their presence a deadly certainty that his life as a billionaire was over. "Mr. Hale, we need you to come with us for questioning," one of them said, his voice flat and devoid of any sympathy. Marcus looked up, his face pale and slick with sweat. He looked at me, his eyes darting frantically, searching for a spark of the woman he used to break with a single word. He looked like a man drowning on dry land. "Evelyn, please," he rasped, his voice catching in a dry, painful sob. You can't let them do this. I did it for us. I did it so we would never have to worry about anything. Talk to them. Please. Tell them you signed it. Tell them it was a mistake." I didn't answer. I didn't even blink. I watched with a detached, clinical interest as they pulled him to his feet. He stumbled, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the polished floor as his knees buckled. As they led him toward the side exit in handcuffs, he looked back over his shoulder one last time. The man who had mocked me, controlled me, and tried to destroy my future was now nothing more than a frightened child in a $1,000 suit. I stood up slowly and walked toward the back of the courtroom. The media was in a frenzy, shouting questions at Rachel and the Hales' lead counsel, who was trying to shield his face from the cameras. In the chaos of the scandal, I was a ghost. No one stopped me. No one asked for my side of the story. To the world, I was just the catalyst they would soon forget, and that was exactly how I wanted it. As I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped into the cool hallway, a memory surfaced with a clarity that felt like a sharp blade. I remembered the night Marcus threw the ring at me. I could still see the way the diamond caught the light as it skittered across the floor, and I could still hear the jagged edge of his laughter echoing in our empty house. "Your fiancé was smart to run," he had said that night, laughing as if it were the funniest joke in the world. He had meant it as a final insult, a reminder that I was unwanted and unworthy of loyalty. But standing here now, I realized he was right. My first fiancé was smart to run, and I was even smarter to stay and wait for the right moment to strike. I thought about the 5-carat diamond that had once been the symbol of my supposed worth. Now, that ring and the millions it represented were nothing more than evidence tagged in a federal vault. It was just carbon and metal, stripped of the power Marcus had used to bind me. My revenge wasn't a scream. It wasn't a public scene or a dramatic confession. It was a cold, absolute dismantling of his reality. I had played the role of the fool so perfectly that he had handed me the very shovel I used to dig his professional and personal grave. I walked out of the courthouse and into the bright afternoon sun. For the first time in 5 years, the air didn't feel thin. The weight of the Hale name was gone. The fear of the next insult was gone. I walked toward the parking lot, my pace steady and my head held high. As I reached my car, I paused and looked back at the stone pillars of the building. Marcus would spend the next several hours in a small, windowless room, answering questions that had no good answers. Beatrice would spend the rest of her life trying to scrub the stain of a federal indictment from a name that used to mean everything. I turned the key in the ignition and felt the engine hum to life. I wasn't just leaving a marriage or a courtroom. I was reclaiming the 100% of my soul that I had almost lost to a man who never deserved it. I pulled out into the street, disappearing into the city traffic, finally in control of every single breath I took. Thank you for listening to this story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us by clicking the hype button so more people can hear this story.